So if you're seeing our screen, then you're in the right spot. Really excited that you can join us today. We've got a wonderful group of people who are registered, and we're going to get started in just 30 seconds. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Dr. Jeff Soloway. I'm the co-founder and chief training director at MindWellU. MindWellU offers online and in-person evidence-based training in mindfulness for organizations across Canada and into the United States. Delighted to be here to host this webinar today and to look at the connections between giving voice to values and mindfulness. We've been working with amazing organizations, and our real goal at MindWellU is to help make mindfulness more accessible and relevant for all people. We're delighted today to be partnering with Whistleblower Security to bring you this webinar. Whistleblower Security provides top-notch ethics reporting services to clients. And like MindWellU, they support organizations regardless of size, industry, or geography. We're working with Shannon Walker and her team at Whistleblower Security on a number of exciting initiatives, and we look forward to rolling those out in the coming future. So before I introduce our special guest today, I'd like to just give you a few housekeeping items. Okay, so my hope is that you have no technical issues, but if you do have any problems, I encourage you to refresh the page or perhaps make a small note in the chat box. I want to let you know that we are recording today's webinar, and we're going to send everybody a link to the webinar tomorrow, and so you'll be able to watch it and you'll be able to share it with whoever you'd like. We're also going to send you a link where you're going to be able to sign up for the 30-day mindfulness challenge. And the 30-day mindfulness challenge is MindWellU's online training in mindfulness. So you're going to be able to take that training for free tomorrow. And when you take that training, you also get to invite a buddy to take that training with you. So we work with a whole host of organizations who take this training, from Coca-Cola, Mental Health Commission of Canada, Harvard Law School, and you're going to have an opportunity to try this out yourself. We've had an amazing response to today's webinar, and we know that that's likely due to our amazing guest that we have, Dr. Mary Gentili. And Dr. Mary Gentili consults on management, education, and values-driven leadership. She's worked at Harvard Business School for over 10 years, really championing that work at Harvard Business School. She's currently professor of practice at University of Virginia Darden School of Business and creative director of Giving Voice to Values. So delighted to welcome Mary with us today. Thank you, Mary, very much for joining us.
I'm happy to be here.
I'd love to start us out with a little bit of background on your work and what inspired you to write the book, Giving Voice to Values.
Well, I like to tell people that this work grew out of my own personal crisis of faith. I had been working in the field of values-driven leadership development, business ethics education, at leading business schools and at companies for several decades. And in the late 90s, turn of the last century, I had this crisis of faith where I began to think that maybe trying to teach about these issues in business schools and in companies was at best futile and at worst perhaps hypocritical. And I had that feeling because it seemed to me that what we would typically do is share values conflicts, business ethics scenarios, dilemmas with people, and they would read them and they would come into a conversation and they would, have an idea of what they thought the right thing to do was. But in the course of the conversation, two things would happen. The first thing is that their thinking would become more complex. I think that's a good thing. You don't want people to be naive. But the second thing that would happen is that typically there'd be some folks in the room who, when they spoke, everybody tended to listen to them. They might be the most articulate. They might be the ones who, came from the organization that you wanted to go to eventually. But whatever it was, those folks, the ones everyone listened to, were the ones who would be voicing the most skeptical, if not cynical positions. The ones who'd be saying, I know what you want me to say, Mary, but in the real world, it's just not possible. And so I began to think, well, gee, people are walking out of these conversations more confused and less empowered. They even may feel, somehow supported in their sense that they had no choice. I felt like, well, life is short. That's not how I want to spend my time. And so, I took a break from this work. And a number of things happened at that point over a period of years, which led me to create an entirely different approach to values-driven leadership development and to business ethics education. Instead of approaching it as a cognitive issue where you have to reason your way through some ethical dilemma, I actually start from the place that a lot of us actually have values and know what we think is right, just don't think we have a choice. And there's a lot of ways that we can actually build the moral muscle memory, as I call it, to actually do the right thing. And that's what Giving Voice to Values is about as a pedagogy.
The moral muscle memory.
Yeah.
I like that. We actually just asked our audience a poll here. Maybe you see it on your screen. I'll give you a moment to just look at that question and the results and get your perspective on that. And while I just mention one other thing to our audience today is that we are going to ask you a number of polls, as you see, and we'd love your participation in that. And we really try and make our webinars participatory. So if you have questions for Mary, please put it in the chat window, and I will do my best to ask that question, bring it forward at the appropriate time in our conversation today. So Mary, did you see, when it comes to values conflicts in the workplace, everybody has a different set of values, so it's very difficult to communicate about them. And we've got 55% of the audience somewhat agree, and then another 20 strongly agree with that.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you talk about values, and that question is one of the questions that I'll ask people as a coming in question. And then we'll have a conversation about the Giving Voice to Values approach, and then we'll ask it again to see if they change their mind. But the way we talk about values and giving voice to values is, a lot of people will say, well, values are entirely relative. It's a cultural thing, it's a religious thing, a political thing, wherever you came from, your family background. And so, you really can't have this conversation. And other people will be at the other end of the spectrum who will say, no. These are the ones the strongly disagree people. They'll say, no. There are a set of universal values, and I know what they are, and it really doesn't matter what you think. And either one of those positions basically prevents the conversation I'm talking about, total absolutism or total relativism. And so what we talk about when we talk about giving voice to values is that there is research that suggests that, yes, of course, there are cultural differences, but beyond that, there do tend to be a set of values that are basically universally shared. The philosophers call them hypernorms. But the thing is, it's a very high-level list, and it's a very short list. So the good news is there may be some basis for common conversation, but the other news is that it's a very short list. And so what we'll tend to talk to people about is, look, if you're looking at a values conflict, first ask yourself, does it rise to the level of one of these core values, one of these hypernorms? Or is this more a matter of my personal preference, my comfort level? If it does rise to that level, and then I want to talk to you about it, I should use a language and a framing that will appeal to the values that you and I are likely to share, rather than framing it in a language and an approach that comes directly and exclusively from my own background, my own religion, my own politics, my own experience. And so we use that observation and that research as a foundation for figuring out how to talk about these things with people who may disagree with me. So, after we've explained some of these ideas and given people a chance to rehearse some of our giving voice to values scenarios, we'll often ask that question again and see if maybe some of them have shifted their perspective.
Right. And why are you so passionate about it? Why is it so important to give employees these skills and confidence to support and raise these workplace issues? that align with their values.
Yeah. I think there's both the personal answer and then there's the broader answer. I mean, at the personal level, I know what it feels like to care about something and feel like I'm not able to communicate it, or I don't have the courage or the competence, the confidence to communicate it. I'm basically an introvert. I know that there would be times when I'd observe what I thought was injustice, and I wouldn't necessarily have the nerve or the language to figure out how to talk about it or how to talk about it effectively. Or if I did raise it, I'd raise it in an emotional way that was ineffective. So at the personal level, that motivates me. But at the broader level, I think it was just so frustrating to be in so many organizations and educational contexts and to hear person after person expressing basically the sense that, well, I know what I think is right, but I don't have a choice. And it just felt wrong to me. It's like, we're human beings. We should have choices, right? And so this is really more about helping people be who they really are, be authentic.
And what do you see as some of the greatest barriers to helping people be more authentic and speak their values?
Well, it's funny, a lot of times people will say, well, you need moral courage. And, I'm all in favor of moral courage. I don't have anything against moral courage. I think it's a great thing. But I think it's kind of a high bar. And what I found is that if people get more comfortable, if people get more skillful, if people have more of what I call moral competence and the habit of effectively raising these kinds of issues, then the level of moral courage that's required is perhaps not quite so great. And so, I've learned from both personal experience, but also from the research, that if you really want to have an impact on people's behavior, that rehearsal and practice and pre-scripting and peer coaching are very effective strategies for doing that. There's a whole stream of research in psychology, folks who their work is often referred to as a study of positive deviance, people who deviate from the norm, but in a positive direction. And they have a nice way of phrasing this. This is their phrase, not mine. They'll say, if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, it's more effective to ask them to, rather than asking them to think their way into a different way of acting, it's more effective to have them act their way into a different way of thinking. And the Giving Voice to Values pedagogy, if you will, the methodology, involves people in that kind of rehearsal, practice, and peer coaching. And the other thing is that, when I was first creating this approach, I found that there was research in a whole lot of disciplines that was beginning to suggest that rehearsal is a very important way to build competence and to build habits. In psychology, there's a lot of work now on habit formation. In the neurosciences, we know now a lot more about brain plasticity and creating new neural pathways. Even in the field of kinesthetics, we've studied, the idea of specific state muscle memory, which is where I got the idea of the moral muscle memory. So those are the ideas behind building that competence.
All right. And, we do a lot of, we frame a lot of the work that we do around mindfulness in relation to the habit formation and neuroplasticity, because we're cultivating this habit of mindfulness in our daily life. And in our 30-day mindfulness challenge, we're teaching people a practice called Take 5, and we're asking them to do that repeatedly in everyday life. So we're building those neural pathways in everyday life, and then they're more able to draw upon that throughout their life. So very similar type of thinking in terms of very action-oriented perspective.
Yeah, I saw a lot of connections between when I looked at what you all are doing and what I'm trying to do with GVV. One of the things that seemed like a particular connection we have 7 pillars of Giving Voice to Values, and one of them is called normalization. And the idea is that we often experience values conflicts. You're working along, you're doing your job, you got your head down, and something happens. Your boss tells you to do something, a colleague asks you to do something, a customer is pressuring you to do something. And before you can even think about, how can I act on this? You know, you get this feeling in your gut. It's a little dodgy. It's a little off. Before you can even think about acting, all of what I call the preemptive rationalizations rush in. Things like, maybe I don't have all the information, or maybe this is just how it's done here, or maybe it is wrong, but it's really above my pay grade. It's not my responsibility. Or, you know, I feel loyal to the person who's asking me to do this. And all of these rationalizations, you know, some of them may be true, but they rush in before we've even considered how we could act. And so what GVV is about, giving voice to values, I call it GVV, what that's about is spreading out the time between the moment when you get that feeling that something's dodgy and the moment those preemptive rationalizations rush in, to spread that time out, to create a kind of safe space, a laboratory, to simply ask, what if I were going to act? How might I get that done? We know from the research on creativity that people are more innovative when you take the pressure down. And I think that the mindfulness techniques are all also about taking that pressure down. It's not that you're not aware of the conflict. You are very much in the moment, but you're focused on the moment as opposed to all those other stories that are in your head about what might happen, what might go wrong, what, you know, whether I'm competent. They're all floating around out there, but they're not ruling you. And so what we're trying to do is give people the opportunity to create that space and practice that. And I think there are a lot of connections with what you all are doing from my reading of it.
Right. No, it's an exciting conversation for us because I think there is such a great alignment. You mentioned about creating that space. And I think from a neuroscience perspective, what the research is showing is that with a mindfulness practice, you are creating that space. And what you're doing is you're bringing online the prefrontal cortex and you're moving out from the limbic system, the reactive mode of mind, when you're on automatic and you're just caught up in often negative discursive thinking and some of these preemptive rationalizations. And you're coming into a space where you can recognize those thoughts, and sometimes we call them thought trains, but choose not to get on those thought trains. So
watch them go on by.
That's right. That's what we say. We say we can just stay at the station and let the thought trains go by. So with mindfulness, you're gaining that awareness. So mindfulness at a very basic level is just self-awareness and awareness of the thoughts that are going through your mind or emotions that are arising while they're happening. And while you accurately said, it's not that you're not going to experience them. You're going to know that they're happening, but you don't necessarily have to react to them. With mindfulness, we're giving ourselves the ability to pause and then to respond skillfully. So I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, and I think there's another piece to it too. You know, in my field, there's increasingly a lot of research, behavioral ethics, behavioral finance, behavioral economics, and, you know, we're looking at how people, you know, of course, behavioral psychology, and of course, we're looking at how people react. And what's interesting about it is that there's a sort of famous article by Jonathan Haidt called the emotional tail that wags the rational dog. It's basically the idea, it's a similar idea to Kahneman and Tversky, but it's the idea that when we encounter these values conflicts, we act out of emotion, and then we rationalize post hoc why it was the right thing to do or why it was the only thing we could do. No, this isn't. It happens unconsciously. It happens very fast. But what we're trying to do, I think, with mindfulness and with GVV, giving voice to values, is to basically rewire that connection a bit. Because part of what we're finding with people who are using giving voice to values is that they're more likely to recognize a values conflict and ethical issue than they might have before. It's not just that they're more likely to act, but they're also more likely to see the issue. And I think that's because, in fact, they have created that space, they've brought that emotion down, and they've actually allowed themselves to perceive that they have choices that they didn't allow themselves to perceive before. None of this is a decision you make consciously. But I think it's really fascinating that there is the potential for that kind of rewiring, and I think mindfulness does a very similar thing.
Right, and maybe this speaks to the latest poll question was, I would like to voice my values more often and more effectively, and we have close to 90% either strongly agreed or somewhat agreed with that statement. So perhaps is that something common you see?
Oh, God, yes. You know, I interviewed people for creating the Giving Voice to Values curriculum and training program for for companies and other organizations and schools, I gathered lots and lots of stories. We have hundreds of pieces of material, stories from asking people, tell me about a time when you encountered a values conflict in your workplace and how you handled it. And, it's interesting because people would tell me the stories of the times when they effectively acted on their values, but also the times when they didn't. And I would always ask them, so why didn't you when you didn't? And they almost always said, because I didn't think I had a choice. It wasn't because they didn't want to. It wasn't because they didn't care. It was because they felt like they didn't have the option. And, so that poll response is not at all surprising to me. I mean, this is really about allowing people to be more fully who they are and to be that way effectively. I think the other point that always interests me is I'll sometimes give talks about this. I remember giving a talk once, and there was a woman in the back of the room, and while I was speaking, you could see her face going red, and she was getting kind of tense. And as soon as I stopped and asked for comments or questions, her hand went up. So I called on her right away, and she was pretty angry. And she said, well, this is ridiculous. She said, I don't need this. She said, I always voice my values. And then she paused, and then she said, no one ever listens, but I always voice my values. And so, that's GVV is about that. It's about, look, if you just want to be righteous, fine. Don't worry about this. But if you really want to be effective, then you actually need to think about, how do I connect with the person on the other side of the conversation? And I think that the rehearsal we use, as well as some of the self-management techniques that one can gather from mindfulness exercises, are part of what help people to be more effective and not just righteous.
All right. So one last comment on this thread that I'll just make is what's getting in the way of people voicing those values. And we did some research on our mindfulness training a couple years ago through the Sauder School of Business at UBC, at University of British Columbia. And one of the key findings there was around conflict and behavior around conflict. And my sense is that voicing your values may feel like conflict, and it's a conflict situation. And so what are people's tendencies in conflict behavior? And there's a tendency to avoid conflict. And what we found
fight or flight.
Right. And with this training, what we found is that people went through the mindfulness training, became less conflict avoidance. So they were more likely to approach the conflict. And one of the key mediators of that was emotional acceptance. So there was a piece around getting in touch with the emotions, not letting the emotion, which might have felt uncomfortable or challenging, stop them from moving forward. So, and feels like that's what we were just talking about.
Hugely, yeah, that's hugely a part of it. It's interesting. One of the other pillars of giving voice to values that I think resonates with what you just said, and also with some of what people can gain from mindfulness exercises, is that we call it the pillar of self-knowledge and alignment. And it grew out of my personal sense and then my research, but initially just the sense that as an introvert, as someone who's a bit risk averse is how I saw myself, I sort of felt like I'm doomed to be the kind of person who sees problems but isn't actually able to intervene and deal with them, because they do require conflict. They do require this kind of, assertive behavior. That's what I thought. But when I started talking to people and gathering stories, what I found that sure enough, those people who saw themselves as aggressive and assertive and extroverted would tell me stories of acting on their values. And when I'd say, how did you do it? They'd say, well, I've always been a risk taker, so why not take a risk in the service of something that matters to me? But then I remember talking to some other people. I remember talking to one woman who was working in the finance area. And, she told me a story. I won't share it now for time, but at the end of the story, I said, how did you do that? You describe yourself as more introverted and risk averse. And she said, oh God, yes. She said, I'm a really fearful person, very conservative person, risk averse, a real people pleaser. I'll do anything to keep people happy. And I said, well, then how did you do this? And she said, well, because I see myself as fearful, this seemed like a safer route, a more conservative route. And so it was interesting to me. I realized that, anybody can do this, but you need to frame the problem in a way that plays to who you feel you are, who you place to your own strengths. So some of it is self-knowledge, some of it is self-acceptance, and some of it is self-appreciation. This is how I'm effective. I know I'm effective through asking questions, so I'm going to do it that way. So part of what we do with Giving Voice to Values is help people, rather than fighting with themselves, to accept who they are and then let that be their strength.
Interesting. Sounds like there's another key thread between the two fields of self-compassion, which is such a dominant piece within mindfulness training. I want to go in two different places here, Mary, and we've got a question from somebody in the audience that I'm going to ask in just a moment, and it's going to start to lead us into some of these strategies that we can use and some practical strategies and tips, which we'll get into in a moment. But before we go there's just one poll which was relevant to what you were talking about in terms of believing that to deliver a values-based message, you need to have a firm conviction and often require these heated arguments. And I think you were just speaking to that. And we see a pretty distributed response from our participants here. So, my guess is that some people might think that that's automatically what you need to have, but I think we're actually seeing something different with the audience. And I think you just expressed a slightly different or nuanced perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think sometimes the way we gin up the courage, we gin up the energy to express something that we think is going to be problematic is by expressing it in that kind of combative or confrontive or conflictive way. But part of what I'm trying to do is to bring that emotion down, to normalize these experiences, to make them less surprising, less shocking, less deer in headlight moments, through practice, through rehearsal, through acceptance, so that you don't have to go to that conflict place in order to even raise the issue, because often that's when we're least articulate and least impactful or effective. I remember reading an interview right after the most recent elections in the United States, which, as you know, it's been a kind of conflicted time in our country and pretty divisive political discourse. And there was an interview I was reading, I don't remember what paper it was, but it was with a psychologist. And he said something I thought was really interesting. He said, if you want to have a conversation across this very contested, very intense divide that we're experiencing right now in our country, he said, you have to, no matter which side you're on, you have to find a way to express your views so that the person you're trying to communicate with, in order to hear you, they don't have to stand in a place of humiliation. So in other words, you have to express it in a way that because if you're going to require them to think that they're utterly without value or intelligence in order to hear what you're saying, they're going to be motivated to protect themselves. And so there has to be a way to frame it that doesn't require someone to stand in that place of humiliation. And I thought that was it's a difficult thing, but I thought it was a really important point. And often that conflictive conversation is about putting someone into that stance of humiliation.
Thank you, Mary. I'd love to move us forward in terms of some strategies about how do you do that? Not put somebody in a place of feeling humiliated, and maybe to provide some examples of teaching people or managers what to do and say when they know what they think is right. And before we actually go there, I want to just ask a question that was posed by someone in our audience. And the question was, how to approach management with workplace issues without it feeling like it is being pushed in the corner and in a delicate situation of having to say yes or no.
Without putting the manager in the position of feeling that they have to say yes or no? Is that, I'm trying
yes, I believe.
Is that, yeah.
How to approach management with workplace issues without it feeling like it is being pushed in the corner. It is being pushed in the corner and is in the delicate situation of having to say yes or no.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've done a good bit of work with that in organizations where we're doing trainings around giving voice to values and how to raise issues effectively. And in one of my trainings, actually it happened in Africa. It was with a major multinational, but we were doing some work in Nigeria, and we actually experimented with something, which I think gets to this question. We developed some GVV, giving voice to values scenarios, which I may or may not have mentioned. They're always scenarios that have a values conflict, but the actor in the scenario has already decided what they think is right. So the question is, how do you express it and effectively? And so we had these scenarios, and we put a bunch of selected middle managers in groups to try and come up with scripts and action plans about how to raise the issue. And then we had all the senior management of the same organization in Nigeria at their own tables. And their task was to read the same scenario, but to answer the question, how could someone raise this to you in a way that would make it easier for you to respond effectively? And it was really interesting when they came back to debrief, because this kind of natural social contracting started to happen. So, you can imagine what the middle managers were saying. They were talking about not wanting to have the messenger be killed and not wanting to be brushed aside, wanting there to be some ongoing communication about what happened. But what was interesting is the senior management, we were talking about some very basic things, but, don't grab me in the hallway and give me this bad news. It's always bad news. It's always often costly. It's like someone coming into my office and placing a turd on my desk, and it's like, well, how do we handle this? And so they said, set an appointment up, make sure that I'm in a situation where I feel calm to hear your message. Number one. Number two, do a little homework, bring some data. Don't just tell me you feel that something is X, Y, and Z. Number three, actually present some scenarios, some approaches, some possible solutions. Even if they're not the ones we will ultimately use, I feel like then we're on the same side trying to problem solve together. And I don't feel like you've just come to me to blame me for X, Y, and Z. Now, it may be that you actually do blame them, but this is about helping them be in the conversation with you, not standing in the place of humiliation, but somehow feeling engaged. So they ended up coming up with these lists of, fairly basic communication strategies. And they decided to create what they called the Giving Voice to Values deal, where they all committed that, we will do these three things when we see values conflicts if you, senior management, will agree to do these three things. And they kind of made this sort of agreement. And it was something they generated out of this joint conversation. But it was shifting the emphasis away from who's to blame and shifting the emphasis to how could we resolve some of these thorny questions, which I thought was an interesting approach.
Great. We had a poll that we asked people about if they have an important or difficult message to deliver, if they pre-script or practice out loud. And so we had, 85% agreed, somewhat agreed or strongly agreed with that. So it sounds like people are using that type of a strategy. Are there some other, specific activities that you do in your work with people?
Yeah. So there's a number of things we do. One of the things we do is we actually have a protocol of questions we work people through. I won't go through all of them, but one of them involves asking what's at risk for everyone affected by this decision, including yourself, but everyone else as well. And the reason we do that is not to do, a traditional stakeholder analysis, but rather to understand why would somebody possibly be motivated not to hear me? Or how might I frame this in a way that I'm actually helping them recognize that I'm aware of what's at risk for them, and I'm trying to raise this in a way that doesn't go there. Or if I can't eliminate the risk, at least simply acknowledging that I'm aware of what I'm asking. And then the impacts on other players end up being some of your arguments as well. So one of the things we do is engage people in truly seeing it through the other person's eyes, not to change their viewpoint necessarily, but to understand where the leverage might be and how they might reframe the challenge. I can give you an example. We have a case in our curriculum. It's about these are all based on real situations. It's about a woman whose manager came in. They were a financial firm and managed the portfolios of wealthy individuals. her manager came to her one day and said, I'm meeting with this gentleman this afternoon. His financial portfolio has significantly underperformed what we had predicted, and it didn't meet the benchmarks that we set. So I want you to come up with a different benchmark that makes it look like he did better, because he's an unsophisticated investor. He won't know the difference. There's a little bit more detail to it than that. But what she did was kind of interesting. She didn't want to do that. But she was new. She didn't really know her boss. She wasn't sure how direct she could be with him. She didn't know if this is really who he was. So what she ended up doing is saying to him, look, I really can't do that. I don't have time to do that in a way that will be compelling or persuasive. But what I can do and what I have done is created a script for you that explains exactly where we went off track and why and how we're correcting it next quarter. And she gave him the script, and she wasn't sure if he would be okay with that. He wasn't thrilled, but he said, all right, and he used it. And the client wasn't thrilled, but he understood, and it went on. And what she kind of had realized was that her boss was not invested in being unethical. He was invested in getting through a very difficult conversation. And so what she did is she solved his problem, but in a different way. And so her boss knew why she didn't want to do what he asked, without her having said, my God, you're unethical. But she allowed him to save face, and she also formed the foundation for them to have some trust between them, so that he knew that she wasn't out to get him or to prove him to be a jerk. She allowed him to save face, but she also had her line of integrity. And so some of what we're doing is that, helping people understand that there may be ways to communicate some of these things that allow people not to stand in that place of humiliation and yet can still have a positive impact. The second strategy I'll mention, there's lots of them, but the second one I'll mention right now is that we also try and predict the kinds of frequently heard objections to values-based positions. We call them the reasons and rationalizations. And we've identified 4 of them that seem to be the most frequent ones that we hear in business. You hear others, of course, and in other industries or professions, you may have some additional ones. But what we've done is, because they're so predictable, because they're so ubiquitous, and they are powerful, but they're predictable, so you can, in fact, think about them in advance and think about, well, how could I respond to this effectively? And so we actually get people to think through ways to reframe these particular rationalizations. Obviously, you have to dress them up in the language of the particular circumstance. But a lot of what happens with values issues, as I said earlier, is that people get this deer in headlight moment and they just can't think, And so part of this is that we've released that. We've given them the chance to rehearse, to have access to their full panoply of ideas, rather than to simply go down that knee-jerk immediate path of reactivity. And so some of those strategies can be very helpful.
I'm starting to hear something around the organizational culture and and the ability to communicate in this way within a culture. And so I'm wondering, how much do you work with organizations around that and making that level of conversation feel more normal or normalized, like you say?
Yeah. So it's interesting. When I created this approach, my goal was to transform management education. I really wasn't thinking about organizational work. And what's happened is that companies and other organizations have come to us and said, we want to use this. So I always present it as a pilot and say, look, well, we can experiment with it, And initially, it was usually people coming to me from their ethics or their compliance groups, sometimes a general counsel or risk management. And then increasingly, we started to be approached by the leadership people in the organization, leadership development people, or the learning people. And they really were more interested in thinking about it as a cultural thing. And then sometimes we now also get approached by a senior executive, like the president or the COO of a company, and they're usually thinking about it as a cultural thing. What we've found is that the skills we're talking about here, even though I come to it from a values and ethics angle, what companies realize is it's all about leadership, right? It's all about communicating about challenging issues and times when we disagree. And so it's useful in many other ways. And even some of the research that's been done by companies about the impact of using this approach has suggested more of a culture change than simply a change around values issues. So, for example, one of the organizations that's been using this the longest, a global company, has said that what they've found is not only are people raising issues more often when they encounter values conflicts, but they're bringing them to their ethics officers and saying, something's going on in my team. I think it's wrong. I want to deal with it. But will you work with me to create a script and action plan to be able to effectively deal with it? So from the point of view of the company, this means they're getting better information, and it's more true culture change. I mean, rather than taking the issue and dumping it in the police's lap, it's someone wanting to take ownership for changing the experience within their own team or the relationships with their own colleagues or their own managers. And so that's part of what we're trying to do, is to create a better conversation. And I just came back from a day with an organization last week, and it was, they approached me and I said, I don't think I'm the right person for you, because it wasn't really about ethical infractions. It really was about an organization that had gone through some pretty painful and significant leadership challenges and changes. And the culture had basically lost trust in each other. But they actually saw GVV as a mechanism for building trust. And so we started that process, and I actually was surprised to see the power of that. So I think you're absolutely right. Even though I don't market it that way or promote it or discuss it that way, it is about changing a conversation, and that's changing the culture. Speak Jack theory, right?
Yeah, and I see there's a couple questions from participants, which we're going to get to in just a moment. I'm going to put another invitation to people that if you have a question, to please put it in. We've got about 15 minutes left together. And just following up on the culture, it's become similar to what you were just speaking to. Our work with mindfulness training in the workplace, it's become more of a culture shift, and that's what we've really kind of uncovered, is people, the way that they're working together and being able to implement this practice of Take 5 in the midst of their life, in a meeting, in a water cooler conversation, or in conflict. It's an invitation to how people are into the very fabric of the organization. So it's been fascinating to see how, when you roll out our 30-day mindfulness challenge, it's over a whole year. And so it could be run over a large organization, and that's how multinational organizations are offering it. And slowly people learn the skills and start adopting it into their everyday life and practice. And I talk about it as like a literacy of mindfulness. And people, it's a new skill, and mindfulness is relatively new, and now we start to see it being taught in education, public education. We're teaching kindergarten kids about mindfulness. And so today, kindergarten kids are learning mindfulness, but the people in the workplace missed that education. And so now we're teaching it there. So it's we like to talk about it as a core competency that can become part of a culture within an organization.
Yeah, and it's the competency, and it's also giving them a language. I mean, I think if you name some of those kinds of behaviors, it makes it easier for people to engage in them, and they become more conscious of it. So I think that's a very powerful tool.
Mm-hmm. So I've got a question, and it related a little bit a few moments ago in our conversation, but still relevant here. About, can you speak to how the dynamic of power plays? So how the role of power in these conversations. There have been times I've not given voice to value because I'm thinking about job security. So no doubt you've heard that before, and love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah. So, that's huge. And I think it's one of when people say I didn't have a choice to act on their values, to voice their values, it's often the blanket language to say, there was a power dynamic, and it was someone who was in a position of authority over me, or, to whom I felt somewhat vulnerable, who was pressuring me to do whatever it was. And so that is, of course, a huge part of it. But I think part of what stops us then is that we assume that the only way we're going to raise it is by somehow bringing down the power, somehow, rubbing their noses in what they did wrong, or humiliating them, or revealing them, somehow calling them out. And of course that does happen. But a lot of what we're trying to talk about are all the many, many times where you can actually shift the conversation and reframe it. I think often people hear the phrase giving voice to values, and they think what it's about is whistleblowing. They think what it's about is, stamping your foot and shaking your fist and speaking truth to power. And of course, those things are necessary sometimes. Stakes are high, lives are at risk, or time is very short. But what giving voice to values is about is all those other times leading up to those moments where the decisions may be smaller and the ability to act on them may be greater because, in fact, the risk is less, because, in fact, the impact is less. And sometimes that will be the rationalization people will give. They'll say, it's not a big enough deal to take this action. And frankly, that's kind of the reverse. That's one of the ones that will reverse and say, if it's not a big deal, it's easier. It's going to be a lot harder when you wait till the oil spill or when you wait till the scandal hits the news, So what we're trying to do is build an ongoing conversation of open inquiry. I did some work a few years ago with a major consulting firm, and one of their stated values was, a lot of companies will have value statements, and they'll have things like inclusion and integrity and things like that. This one, they had some of those, but they also had one where one of the stated values was the obligation to dissent. And I think that's really interesting because what they were saying is, we get business because we're smart. And if you know something and you don't share it, then we're not optimizing what we have to offer our clients. And so, we built off that value and kind of said, what we're talking about here is having that full conversation. And it doesn't mean you're telling people they're bad or they're wrong. It means that you're getting more information into the conversation. It's kind of like when people say, bring your whole self to work. It's not because the part you're bringing is bad or wrong. It's just that there's more to you than that. And I think mindfulness is all about that.
We have a question that follows up from that, and I think you just touched on it a bit, but I think it hits a real point for a lot of people. Is that what if you're in a culture organization that feels more toxic and that feels like your voice is being suppressed and there's not an openness for you to share? What would you suggest to someone in that situation?
Yeah, well, it depends on degree. And if I was talking to someone, I could ask some more questions and get details. There are some organizations that have gone to a point where it's going to be very difficult to change the culture at this point without some sort of major upheaval. And in a circumstance like that, these strategies I'm talking about may not be as effective. But what we know is that there actually that's not where you start in an organization. Organizations become that way over time. And it's also not, It's not, the word I'm looking for is it's not like distributed throughout the whole organization. There are pockets of different kinds of behaviors. You can be in an organization and, say it's a good organization or a bad organization, a sick organization or a healthy organization. That's a little too simplistic because we know there are divisions and groups and teams that operate in different ways. And so, I think a lot of times you really have to look at how extensive is this, how deeply ingrained is it, and even when you're in an organization where you feel like it's more deeply ingrained, there can be pockets of places where you can actually be more of who you are. But I also believe that there are times when you have to leave an organization because it's going to be damaging to your soul. It's going to be damaging for you. It's kind of like when people quit smoking, their lungs begin to clear immediately. And, I know so many people who, when they have left a truly toxic organization, they gain access to more of who they are because they've been suppressing so much of it. I just think sometimes people jump to saying the organization is toxic when what they may be saying is there is a pocket of behavior, there is an area of dysfunction, there's a dysfunctional leader or manager that people are deferring to, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no hope for that organization. Just as infection can grow, the health can grow in an organization. Sometimes we've had experiences of people who've been working. I have one story, a woman who resisted her boss who was telling her to do something that was clearly unethical. And she found a way to accomplish what he needed her to accomplish without using the methodology that was unethical. And she told me that after that, she felt like she'd failed, because even though she'd been able to maintain her own integrity, she hadn't changed her boss. He still didn't care. He'd said, I don't care how you do it, just get it done. And so when she did it in a way that was ethical, he wasn't any more happy than he would have been if she did it in an unethical way. But what was interesting is that after the fact, other people in the organization, her peers, started coming to her and saying, we've been uncomfortable with that too, and you seem to have found a way, could you teach us how you did it? So what she felt was, well, she didn't change the manager, but she did have an impact on the organization and others within the organization. And so sometimes, I think these things are not all one way or the other. We live in the real world. And part of what I'm trying to do is help people hang on to their own souls, to hang on their own sense of who they are and what matters to them, and to not feel like they have no choice whatsoever. We also know from experience and from some research that if you experience a negative reaction when you're trying to act on your values, people will tend to generalize and say, you can't do that here, it's not possible. If you experience a positive, people tend to think it's the exception. And, it's just kind of how our brains work. It's a self-protective measure. And so we kind of want to help people sort of emphasize that, you can learn from those times when it worked and not necessarily see that as just an aberration.
Right. Interesting. A lot of our work and what we've been hearing from organizations in terms of trying to solve a problem is around, continues to be around stress and mental health. Huge resources being put into mental health and rising statistics around number of employees who are going off work due to stress and mental health issues. And I'm wondering about the connection. Is there a connection that you've made with your work and with GBV?
Yeah, I think it's very connected. I haven't done that research myself, but I think, we all have the experience of knowing that if we are continually silencing ourselves, if we're continually living in a state of where we're acting in a way that conflicts with what matters to us truly, it's a very stressful thing, and people go off and blow off steam, after work. People go out and drink and vent. Increasingly, there are all these websites, if you work at a particular company, companyxyzsucks.com, where people get to vent. And, I think that's because there is this degree of stress that is growing. It's a sense of a lack of efficacy, and so I do think that all the mechanisms we're talking about, both on the mindfulness side and the GVV side, are mechanisms that allow people to kind of take a breath, calm down, be who they are, realizing that, things are neither as good nor as bad as we fear or hope. And I think that's a really liberating thought.
Right. And I mean, the work around stress and what we see in the research is, sometimes you get so caught up in a thought and a strong emotion, and we've triggered our stress response. We might be stressed from life. We had a challenging thing happen in our family life, and we're triggered. Our stress response is a physiological response in our body. A different part of the brain is activated. We've got cortisol affecting everything, and then we come into a situation in the workplace and we get triggered.
Bring it all to it.
Yeah, and we get triggered and we're bringing it all through it, and we have a strong thought. And, maybe it wasn't that situation at work that we had such a strong reaction to, but it was stress of something else. And just the fact that our body has been triggered already, and now we're more, we're alarmed.
Yeah.
And so this role of learning to rebalance our nervous system, which is something that mindfulness training helps us do, helps us to see things from a more balanced place, or we're seeing things a bit clearer. With mindfulness, another way of looking at it is being able to see clearly. Because often our perception is clouded, or we're only looking at the red button, or our buttons are being pushed because we're stressed. When we're stressed, we've got a very narrow perspective. We're looking at trying to, we're looking at what's harming us, or what's difficult. And so when we can start to rebalance our nervous system, things that we thought were such a big deal might not be such a big deal, or not that they're not such a big deal, but we don't react as much to it. One other little point I just wanted to bring up, another connection, was around authenticity. And I know that there's probably something, a connection to GBV around authenticity. And the study we did last year with Sauder School of Business actually found people who went through our mindfulness training had an increase in authenticity. So I wonder what the relationship around authenticity to your work is. And we just have a few moments left, so I'll ask you to be brief if you may.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely tied in. I mean, I'll always talk to people about, GVV is about helping you be more of all of who you are in all of your life, rather than having your work identity and your home identity and your school identity or whatever. And, there's a stress and there's a limitation when you bifurcate yourself that way. You're not able to tap into all your strengths. You're not able to tap into all your skills. And you just always feel like you're a bit acting, and rather than being able to just be transparent. So I think there's a very clear connection. The other thing I would say is that I think one of the things that Giving Voice to Values does is that it's about narrative. It's about looking at the same set of facts that you might look at and creating a different story about what's possible. And so what we're trying to do is to teach people, at heart, we want people to feel like they have choices. And I think that's a huge part of being able to feel like you can be fully yourself as well, when you feel you have choice.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple questions that I see our audience had. One is maybe a briefer one. It's about the 4 ubiquitous objections. I think you mentioned them before. Could you briefly mention what the
they are? Yeah. The ones we see most often are, number 1, it's not material, i.e. it's not a big enough deal. Number 2, it's just standard operating procedure. It's just the way we do it in this organization, this part of the world, this profession. Number 3, we call it locus of responsibility, but it's basically, it may be a problem, but it's not my responsibility. It's above my pay grade. And the 4th one is, we call it locus of loyalty. It may be a problem, but I feel loyal to, and then you fill in the blank. My boss who's telling me to do this, my client who's asking me, my colleague who wants me to cover up, my company who I feel this is an issue for. And so we've identified those 4, and then we've also identified some responses to each of those, which probably a little too lengthy to go in now, but I can share them. They're all on our website.
Great. Well, thank you, Mary. And I'm going to just start our closing here, and then I'll come back to you for any last comment that you'd like to share with the group. So before we sign off, I want to just thank everybody again for their excellent questions. If there was a question that you posted that we didn't have a chance to get to, we'll do our best to actually answer it and post it on the webpage, because tomorrow we're going to send everybody out a link to a webpage that has a copy of this recording and also an invitation to sign up and take the 30-day mindfulness challenge. So you'll receive that tomorrow, and you'll have the opportunity to sign up and learn more about Mary's work as well. I want to let everybody know that next week we've got an exciting webinar coming up about mental health strategy, how a mental health strategy will pay dividends in 2018. That's with Dr. Marie-Hélène Pelletier, and we're really excited to get into that, and you can register for that on our website. And once again, I want to thank our friends Shannon Walker and her team at Whistleblower Security for helping to put this event together. It was a great idea to explore these 2 topics of giving voice to values and mindfulness. And whistleblowing. And so we're just delighted to be working with them. And we're really delighted to have Mary and share this conversation. It was super fascinating, Mary, to begin exploring what these connections are. And I think we uncovered something quite interesting. So really appreciate your time. And if you have any last comments, you're welcome to share it with our group today.
Well, just to thank you for the opportunity, Jeff, and Mindwell U, and to invite anyone who's curious to be in touch with me and or to go to www.givingvoicetovalues.org, and you can find a lot of free materials. And there's my email address.
Yeah, and we posted our email addresses to anybody, and we'll have more of that Mary's website up on the webpage tomorrow. And thank you again to everybody who joined us, and we look forward to being with you again soon.
Thank you.